Paying the Islamic Danegeld by Eternal England. Appeasement is a diplomatic strategy whereby small concessions are given to an enemy in the hopes of preventing all-out war. It is seen as a policy of one-sided concessions to an aggressor, often at the expense of third parties, with nothing offered in return except promises of better behaviour in the future. In the 10 years leading up to Nazi Germany's 1939 invasion of Poland, the strategy of the British government in response to Nazi expansionism had been one of appeasement. It went something like this. Okay, Mr. Hitler, you can have Austria, but that's all, nothing else. Oh, you want the Sudetenland? Fine, but only if you sign this agreement promising that you won't annex the rest of Czechoslovakia. Oh, you've taken the whole of Czechoslovakia. Now, Mr. Hitler, that's quite enough. We can't possibly let you have Poland too. Naming the threat. Amid growing intimidation of politicians on the part of our Muslim population, MPs have now been provided personal bodyguards to protect them from extremism. But it seems no politicians or mainstream journalist wants to name the threat. Extremism doesn't kill people. Extremists do. Use of this language makes it sound as if extremism is some sort of intangible force against which we are powerless to act. Adding to that, it is a certain type of extremist that is the most palpable threat we face at the moment, the Islamic type, though politicians tend to focus only on far-right extremism and keep quiet about the more serious threat. All acts of extremism are, by definition, carried out by individuals or groups of people, not impersonal, uncontrollable forces. Islamic extremism, the result of a foreign ideology and carried out by immigrants and the children of immigrants, is an entirely imported and therefore avoidable issue which would not exist organically in Britain, were it not for the mass importation of Mohammedans and the subsequent issues, grooming gangs, suicide bombings, mass stabbings, beheadings and honour killings, which they bring with them. Following the murder of Sir David Amess, MP for Southend West, in 2021 by a Muslim son of Somali immigrants, MPs set about drafting David's Law, a bill which would strengthen the online safety bill, reducing online anonymity and cracking down on internet trolls. From reading about David's Law, one would get the impression that Sir David had taken his own life after receiving a particularly nasty tweet. For some reason, an instance of an Islamist stabbing a politician to death in broad daylight has generated not a conversation about the risks of a massive inflow of Mohammedans into our country, but instead a conversation about social media bullying. It is pure cowardice on the part of our elected officials that they cannot bring themselves to name the threat, and instead attempt to derail the much-needed conversation about the danger posed by Islam and its adherents. This Huffington Post article about David's Law doesn't even mention the fact that Sir David was murdered, let alone by a crazed Mohammedan. Mark Francois, Tory MP for Rayleigh and Wickford, stated that Amess had become, quote, increasingly concerned about the toxic environment in which MPs had to operate. He then continued with a bizarre and unrelated rant about Facebook and Twitter, saying he would like to drag Mark Zuckerberg and Jack Dorsey, quote, if necessary, kicking and screaming, so they can look us all in the eye and account for their actions, or rather their inactions, that make them even richer than they already are, end quote. Facebook and Twitter didn't kill Sir David. Ali Harbi Ali, a Somalian Muslim, did. Ali had been referred to Prevent, the intervention scheme designed to de-radicalise potential extremists, back in 2014, and was subsequently referred to Channel, another anti-extremism scheme, for intensive support, before being later discharged. Mike Freer, the Conservative MP for Finchley and Golders Green, who received death threats and whose offices were firebombed by Islamists after he spoke out in support of Israel, and who narrowly avoided being murdered by the man who would, a month later, murder Sir David, announced his resignation due to fears for his safety. He unfortunately forgot to comment on exactly what type of person it was who had carried out the string of incidents which led to his decision to resign. Party politics held hostage. Why are our politicians so afraid to speak truthfully about the problem of Islamists in Britain? Presumably the thinking is that unless the Mohammedans are pandered to by one or both of the main two parties, they'll begin to form their own Islamic parties and begin advocating more explicitly for their own religious causes. As it stands, Labour has already made itself dependent on the Mohammedan vote for success by pandering to them so often. This is part of the reason that the Labour Party has become such a mess of contradictions. It simultaneously posits itself as the party which represents the interests of the LGBT lobby, and the party of marginalised groups in general, which, according to their dogma, would include the Mohammedans. It is the party of anti-fascism, but also the party of anti-Semitism. Recently there was a great example of the effects of Muslim intimidation on the Labour Party. We saw the disastrous events of Wednesday 21st February, in which the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, presumably under pressure from Keir Starmer, allowed a Labour amendment to an SNP motion calling for a ceasefire in Gaza to go ahead, despite it being Opposition Day, in which the interests of the Scottish National Party were intended to be front and centre. The Labour amendment was voted on verbally, meaning that there would not be a record of which MP had voted for or against the amendment. Conservative and SNP MPs were rightly outraged at this corrupt act intended to save Keir Starmer from the prospect of his Muslim MPs and constituents' blowback if their other MPs voted against it and walked out. Sir Lindsay, who is a former Labour MP, stated in an apology while holding back tears that he had broken precedent and allowed this to happen in order to protect MPs from potential reprisal, though he neglected to mention that this reprisal would come from Mohammedan constituents, which Labour has put itself in the position of having to pacify, as it depends on their votes. But if our politicians were not so willing to appease the Mohammedans, such a situation would never have occurred. At the time of writing, 71 MPs had sent in letters of no confidence in the Speaker. Each time our politicians pay the Islamic Danegeld, that is, each time they bow to intimidation, they give the Mohammedan contingent more sway over parliamentary procedure. Each time they prevaricate and attempt to blame nasty tweets or Islamophobia for Islamic terrorism, they ensure that such acts will continue. The Mohammedan threat must be cracked down on, but our politicians are cowards, they're afraid to do so. Now, their fear is genuinely understandable, but there can be no negotiation with terrorists. We need bravery and a willingness to name the threat directly. This is the only way to move towards formulating solutions. We must stop pretending that everybody is the same, that those with such vastly different outlooks and morals are capable of coexisting in a liberal democracy, if liberal democracy is to continue. What's that old leftist phrase? We must be intolerant of intolerance. It is high time we rescinded tolerance from those Mohammedans who mistake our kindness for weakness. Lee Anderson, the no-bullshit MP for Ashfield, has had the whip removed from him by the Tory party for Islamophobic comments, after he stated correctly that, quote, "I don't actually believe that the Islamists have got control of our country, but what I do believe is they've got control of Khan and they've got control of London," end quote. Douglas Murray, as usual, puts it best, quote, "It's become a great tradition in UK public life to not confront Islamic extremism. Instead, each time there's an attack or threat, we sacrifice someone who said something about the threat. I see this season Lee Anderson is the votive offering. Brilliant, that'll solve everything." End quote. Following months of weekly pro-Hamas protests in London, and the projection of "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free," a call for genocide against Israeli Jews, onto the Elizabeth Tower on Wednesday 21st, it's hard to say that Khan's London hasn't become overrun with Islamists. The Home Office has had to give out a Jewish community protective security grant to beef up security in Jewish areas, because British Jews are being harassed and intimidated as they visit synagogues. This report naturally neglects to mention exactly who it is that is targeting them. Returning to our definition of appeasement, a policy of one-sided concessions to an aggressor, often at the expense of third parties, it is clear that the political establishment is all too happy to throw British Jews and our elected officials under the bus in exchange for short-term pacification. When our daughters are groomed and gang-raped by Mohammedans, the establishment attempts to sweep it under the rug and label those who voice their concerns Islamophobic. Facing the threat head-on would be too inconvenient for our politicians, and they would run the risk of themselves being labelled racist or Islamophobic. So the slaughtering of children at pop concerts and death threats or violence aimed at MPs doing their jobs must simply continue. If the price of peace is sacrificing more British lives to Islamists in order to kick the can further down the road and pretend that everything is fine, that peace isn't worth having. Not all Muslims are extremists, though. Sure, not all Mohammedans are extremists, but the constant apologetics of so-called moderate Muslims for the actions of Hamas, a proscribed terror organisation, and their persistent failure to speak out against extremism, terror attacks, grooming gangs, and intimidation speaks volumes about their true opinions. Terrifying, though not necessarily surprising, statistics, such as that more British Muslims have joined ISIS than the British Army, point to the stark reality of Muslim sense of alienation in Britain. Of course they feel alienated. British culture is a million miles away from their Islamic culture. Of course they feel they don't belong here. They don't. Their beliefs, their morals, their values are antithetical to those of Britain. The solution, however, is not to bend over backwards to accommodate them, not to change our ways in order to make them feel more welcome, but to be very clear. If you do not want to fit in, you are not welcome here. You're free and encouraged to leave. There are plenty of Muslim countries out there. So-called Islamophobia is the most natural thing in the world, and I'm tired of pretending that it isn't. We must be more willing to speak what we know to be true. There must be a proper open debate about the growing population of Muslims in this country and the problems they cause, and the growing appeasement which cowardly politicians give them, rather than tackling these problems and their root cause. And that is called paying the Danegeld, but we proved it again and again, that if once you have paid him the Danegeld, you never get rid of the Dane. Rudyard Kipling. Thank you for watching.